Ever get that feeling? Like you can see what's coming a mile away, but nobody's listening.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you're shouting into a void, warning everyone, but your words just dominish.
It's like they have blinders on or so.
Exactly. Well, turns out there's a name for that feeling, an ancient myth, actually.
Let me guess. The Cassandra Curse.
Right on the money. And today we are diving deep into this whole Cassandra Curse phenomenon.
I'm ready to dive in. This one's always fascinating.
Me too. Because, let's face it, we've all been there. That moment when, you just know something's a bad idea.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe even a disaster waiting to happen.
Yep.
And you try to warn people, but
Nobody listens.
it's like they don't even hear you.
The worst. And it can be anything, right? From big life choices to, like, telling your friend their new haircut isn't that ideal.
Exactly. Big or small, that feeling of being ignored when you're trying to help. It's universal. And that's why this Cassandra Curse thing is so relatable, even thousands of years later. But before we get into all the modern day stuff, we've got to go back to the source. Ancient Greece, to be precise.
The OG Cassandra, always a good story.
Right. So picture this. The Trojan War is brewing, tensions are high, and our main character, Cassandra, is given this incredible gift by the god Apollo.
The gift of prophecy. She can see the future.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Apollo, being the god of, well, a lot of things, but maybe not always wisdom, he throws in a little twist. A curse.
Nobody will ever believe her prophecies.
Can you imagine seeing the future, knowing what's going to happen, but no matter how hard you try?
Nobody believes you. Talk about a nightmare.
Total nightmare fuel. And that's the essence of the Cassandra Curse, this idea that you can possess true knowledge, vital information, but it's useless because nobody will listen.
It's tragic, really. Both for Cassandra and, honestly, for all of us who've felt that sting of being dismissed,
Yeah.
even when we know in our gut that we're right.
And you know what? It happens way more often than we realize. I mean, think about it. How many times have we seen this play out in the real world?
Oh, countless times.
It's almost like a pattern throughout history, but we'll get into all those juicy examples in a bit. Speaking of those real-world examples, you sent us some fascinating listener mail for today's deep dive.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We asked people to send in their own experiences with the Cassandra Curse.
We did. And wow, did you all deliver? So many great examples of this playing out in everyday life. But before we get to those, let's stick with the historical stuff for a minute. Because it's not just Cassandra, right? I mean, history's full of these figures who tried to warn people only to be ignored or ridiculed.
Totally. And it's amazing how often those ignored warnings led to some pretty unfortunate outcomes.
Right. Talk about a pattern, but why do we do that? Why are we so quick to dismiss these warnings, even when they're coming from people who seem to know what they're talking about? I mean, the podcast excerpt you shared had some really interesting insights into the psychology of all this.
It really does. And honestly, some of it's pretty relatable.
Yeah, like that whole thing about fear being a major factor.
Oh, absolutely. Fear is a powerful motivator, or maybe demotivator in this case.
Right, because nobody wants to hear that the sky is falling. Right. It's way easier to just pretend it's not happening.
Exactly. It's a defense mechanism. Our brains are wired to avoid unpleasant emotions, like fear and anxiety. So when someone comes along and says, hey, you know that thing you're kind of worried about, it's about to get real? Our instinct is often to just tune them out.
Like, nope, not listening, la la la.
Exactly. It's like, if I don't acknowledge the problem, maybe it'll just go away.
Yeah, wishful thinking at its finest. But sometimes it's not even fear, right? Sometimes it's just that we don't trust the source.
Oh, 100%. The messenger is just as important as the message, especially these days.
Especially now with so much information flying around. It's like everybody's an expert, or at least they play one online.
Right. So it's natural that we've become more discerning about who we listen to.
Like, okay, before I upend my entire belief system, you better have more than just a hunch and a strong Instagram following.
Exactly. But the thing is, sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected sources. The podcast excerpt actually mentions this, talking about all those historical figures who were initially dismissed as cranks or outsiders, but were later proven right.
Oh, totally. Like Galileo. He was basically put under house arrest for saying the Earth revolves around the sun, and now look.
Exactly. Or think about Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian doctor, who tried to convince everyone that hand-washing could prevent the spread of disease.
Wait, really? People didn't wash their hands back then? That's
What?
concerning.
I know, right? But back then, his ideas were considered radical, even dangerous. Now, we practically sanitize our mail before we open it. It just goes to show that sometimes the most important voices are the ones that are furthest outside of the mainstream.
It's true. But even when we do trust the source, there's another little psychological trap waiting for us, right?
Oh, there's so many traps. Which one are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of that thing you mentioned earlier, wishful thinking, or as the podcast excerpt so eloquently puts it, optimism bias.
Ah, yes, the belief that things will work out in our favor, even when all logic says otherwise.
Exactly. It's like that friend who always thinks they're going to win the lottery even though they haven't bought a ticket in years.
Oh, I know that friend. Or the person who is convinced their house won't flood, even though they live in a floodplain.
It's almost endearing in a way, that blind optimism. But it can also make us deaf to those Cassandra-like warnings, especially when those warnings involve something unpleasant or inconvenient.
You're telling me. And sadly, sometimes it takes a real wake-up call for people to realize that maybe, just maybe, those warnings were worth paying attention to.
And it makes you wonder how much of what we believe is just us seeking out information that already aligns with our worldview. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. It's like we're all living in our own little echo chambers these days, especially online.
Totally. You go down a rabbit hole of articles or videos that just confirm everything you've ever thought about. Well, anything.
Right. And it feels good, doesn't it? To have your beliefs validated like that.
Oh, it totally does, which is why it's so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Because it keeps us from seeing the bigger picture, right?
100%. That's confirmation bias in a nutshell. We seek out information that confirms what we already believe, and we tend to ignore or dismiss anything that challenges those beliefs.
It's like we're afraid of being wrong. Or maybe just afraid of having to change our minds.
Which is ironic, because being willing to change your mind when presented with new information, that's a sign of growth.
So true. But hey, it's hard, especially in the age of social media, where algorithms are basically designed to, well, keep us in those echo chambers, right?
Oh, absolutely. Social media has become this giant confirmation bias machine.
Which makes breaking free from those echo chambers even more important, right? Like,
Yeah.
we have to actively seek out different perspectives, challenge our own assumptions.
100%. And, the excerpt you sent, it actually brings up a really interesting point about this whole Cassandra Curse thing.
What's that?
What if it's more than just a metaphor? What if there really are people out there who have a sixth sense, so to speak, who can actually glimpse the future?
Okay, see, now that's what I'm talking about. That's the juicy stuff. Because I've definitely had those moments where I just knew something was going to happen, and then boom, it did.
Right, like a weird intuition that you can't really explain.
Exactly. So what if there's more to that? What if some people really are more tuned in to those dot vibes or whatever you want to call them?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? And it's something that humans have been pondering for centuries. Is precognition real? Is intuition something we can cultivate? Or are we all just fooling ourselves?
It really makes you think. Because if we dismiss every instance of someone predicting the future or having some kind of unexplained knowing, are we missing out on something?
It's possible.
Yeah.
And, the excerpt mentions how this ties back to that whole idea of being open-minded,
Yeah.
of not dismissing things outright just because they seem strange or impossible, like those who believe in the paranormal, for example, or fringe scientists who are exploring unconventional theories.
Right. It's like there's this hierarchy of knowledge.
Yeah.
And if something doesn't fit neatly into that hierarchy, it's immediately dismissed as crazy or illegitimate.
Which is a shame, because who knows what we might be missing out on by being so quick to dismiss things that we don't understand.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about the myth, the psychology, the potential for this whole Cassandra thing to be more than just a myth. But what's the takeaway for our listener?
I think the biggest takeaway here is the importance of humility. The world is a complex place, and none of us have all the answers.
Totally. So it's okay to say, I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's even more important to be able to say, I might be wrong.
Which is hard. Nobody likes to be wrong.
True. But it's in those moments of being wrong that we often learn the most. So the next time you encounter a Cassandra, someone who's waving a red flag or maybe just offering a different perspective, take a breath. Listen. Really listen.
Don't let your fear, your biases, or your need to be right shut down the conversation before it even starts.
Because you never know that Cassandra might just be offering you the missing piece of the puzzle you've been searching for. Or at the very least, they'll give you something to think about.
And isn't that what it's all about? Expanding our minds, considering new possibilities.
I think so. That's how we grow, both individually and as a society.
Well said. So, to all our listeners out there, be open to those Cassandra moments. You might be surprised by what you learn. Thanks for diving deep with us today on the Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time for another thought provoking exploration of dot well dot everything.